Welcome to a quiet space in a very loud world. If you are tuning in tonight, I am guessing you are trying to make sense of the financial noise out there. Let us just look at the math and the realities of where we are right now in 2026. We are surrounded by constant headlines, geopolitical debates, policy shifts, and market turbulence. I remember when I was younger looking at the daily market tickers thinking I could outsmart the entire global system by jumping on every single passing trend. I felt like an absolute genius for about 3 weeks, until the market reminded me that I was just an amateur getting a very expensive lesson. That was the day I realized that true financial peace is built on the most unglamorous, predictable, and almost painfully boring truths. Let us pull back the curtain on how the global economy is shifting as we navigate 2026, and let us examine the structural realities beneath the hype. Right now, the collective conversation is completely dominated by inflation, interest rates, and the actions of major central banks. We see institutions like the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve moving with a historical tendency to react aggressively to rising oil prices by tightening policy. But if we step away from the mainstream commentary and look closely at the underlying data, the picture becomes far more nuanced and far more concerning. Even over in Europe, where policymakers are traditionally characterized by a hawkish stance, several officials are quietly expressing deep concerns about the demand side of the economy. The real friction is appearing in the labor market, where structural weakness is showing up long before the full weight of the energy shock is felt. We just witnessed two of the most prominent energy agencies in the world slash their global demand growth forecasts in a manner we typically see during major downturns. The United States Energy Information Administration just lowered its energy demand growth estimate to basically zero for this entire year. Meanwhile, its international counterpart, the International Energy Agency, went even further by projecting that global energy demand will outright contract this year. When you look back at economic history, a synchronized contraction in global energy demand is an exceptionally rare event. The last time we saw this specific dynamic play out was back in 2020, and prior to that, during the great financial crisis of 2009. This is a massive red flag that the global financial markets are largely choosing to ignore because they are hyper-focused on nominal price increases. But as someone who prefers the calm certainty of mathematical relationships, I have to look at the state of the global economy before this shock even materialized. The structural data reveals that the system was already fragile, slowing down and losing its momentum. We can look directly at the manufacturing sectors across Europe, particularly in industrial hubs like Germany, where activity was entrenched in recessionary territory for months. There was a brief moment of optimism when governments stepped in with announcements of increased military and structural spending. Many market participants got incredibly excited, assuming a massive turnaround was underway, which led to a brief period of front-running demand. We saw a similar narrative emerge in the United States, where headlines praised a domestic factory renaissance, creating an illusion that everything was perfectly fine. But beneath that surface layer of corporate optimism, the core metric that matters most, structural hiring, never actually arrived. Instead of expanding their workforce, factories simply adjusted working hours or optimized existing processes because they knew the underlying consumer demand was thin. This is the classic distinction between demand-led inflation and supply-driven energy inflation. When prices rise because consumers have excess cash and are bidding up goods, it reflects a robust, growing economic engine, but when prices rise simply because an essential input like oil becomes scarcer or more expensive due to geopolitical friction, it acts as an immediate tax on the world. The consumer does not have more money to spend. They are simply forced to reallocate their existing income toward necessity items like gasoline and food. As the cost of food and energy absorbs a massive percentage of the household budget, discretionary spending must contract. When discretionary spending drops, it flows backward through the entire supply chain, compressing corporate margins, forcing businesses to cut hours, and eventually leading to mass layoffs. This is a predictable historical sequence that has triggered 4 out of the last 5 recessions in the United States. Yet, history also tells us that central banks have a remarkable talent for raising interest rates directly into the teeth of an oncoming economic slowdown. We saw them execute this exact strategy back in 2008, and they repeated it twice in 2011. Right before major downturns began, they focus entirely on backward-looking inflation metrics, completely missing the real-time deterioration in the labor market. Look at the current employment indicators across the euro area, where year-over-year employment growth has slowed down to a mere 0.5%, a level that historically sits deep within recessionary boundaries in major economies. Like France, payroll numbers have drifted into negative territory for 2 consecutive years, pushing the unemployment rate up to 8.1%. When unemployment rises before the full downstream effects of an energy shock are even processed, it means the structural foundation was already broken. If we look at the forward interest rate markets and analyze the shape of the yield curves, we can see that the professional marketplace is already pricing in this mistake. In the futures markets, specifically looking at instruments like the euro-denominated contracts that mirror our domestic secured overnight financing rate futures, we see a distinct phenomenon known as the frown in the curve. This unique shape indicates that while market participants expect central banks to increase rates in the near term due to nominal inflation fears, they also maintain a firm expectation that policymakers will be forced to pivot and cut rates rapidly in the future. The curve was already inverted before the latest geopolitical conflicts emerged, proving that smart capital recognized the underlying economic weakness long ago. The deep dilemma for central bankers right now is that they are facing this structural slowdown with very little altitude in their interest rates. If a central bank enters a recession with interest rates at 5%, they have 500 basis points of margin to cut rates and attempt to stimulate the economy. But if they are starting from a much lower baseline, they run out of conventional tools almost immediately, forcing them to return to aggressive asset purchasing programs that have historically failed to create organic economic growth. When the marketplace realizes that the central bank has no effective tools left to stop a structural contraction, the illusion of monetary control is completely shattered. As individual allocators of capital, our job is not to try and trade these chaotic central bank pivots or guess the exact month a recession begins. Our job is to construct a personal financial fortress that is completely insulated from their policy errors. When you look at the landscape through this lens, traditional safe havens become incredibly relevant, but they must be approached with modern efficiency. For centuries, physical gold has been recognized as the ultimate store of value during periods of monetary instability and stagflationary shocks. But the historical drawback of holding physical precious metals is that they sit idly in a vault, generating zero yield while costing you money in storage fees. This is a massive structural drag on your capital when you understand the power of compounding interest. There are platforms today like Monetary Metals that are attempting to solve this exact dilemma by allowing individuals to earn a real yield paid directly in physical gold without relinquishing ownership of the asset. Instead of holding a paper claim or a digital fund that is disconnected from the physical reality, your actual metal goes to work, accumulating more ounces over time, fully insured. Whether you choose to allocate a portion of your wealth to yielding precious metals or to broad market equity indexes, the underlying philosophy must remain exactly the same. You want to own productive assets that do not require you to perfectly time the global economic cycle. True financial defense is built on maximizing your cash flow margins when the world is calm, so that when the energy shocks land, you are an observer rather than a victim. I see so many peers in our generation taking massive risks with their capital right now, chasing highly speculative instruments because they feel a deep sense of economic anxiety. They see the rising cost of living, they see the stagnation of real wages, and they assume the only way out is to hit a financial home run. But the math shows us that average hourly earnings in real terms just turn negative due to inflation for the first time. In 4 years, when real wages are shrinking, taking on speculative risk with high leverage is the fastest way to wipe out your initial capital and reset your timeline to zero. The real antidote to economic anxiety is defensive structure. It is keeping your fixed living expenses as low as humanly possible, avoiding the traps of consumer debt, and consistently stacking capital into liquid, productive assets. If you can maintain a high savings rate during a period of global stagflation, you are positioning yourself to acquire high-quality assets at massive discounts. When the cycle eventually bottoms, the math of wealth building is completely counterintuitive because the actions that yield the greatest long-term results feel entirely unexciting on a daily basis. Writing a check to clear a liability or automating an index fund transfer does not give you an adrenaline rush. It is a quiet, solitary process that takes place in the background of your life while you focus on your career and your personal growth. But when you cross that first major milestone of $100,000 in net liquidity, the invisible friction of the early years begins to clear. You realize that you have bought yourself an irreplaceable asset. Time. You are no longer forced to make short-term decisions based on survival or fear. If the global economy slides into a synchronized recession later this year, you have the structural runway to sit completely still and wait for the recovery. Let the central banks play their chaotic game of chasing inflation curves and raising rates into recessions. Let the mainstream media focus on the daily price movements of crude oil and political rhetoric. We will stay grounded in the unglamorous reality of structural numbers, hard assets, and absolute personal consistency. Thank you for sitting down with me in this quiet space tonight. Take care of your capital, trust the mathematical process, and I will talk to you very soon.